We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Deborah Archibald. I'm the Director of the Extractive Resources Governance Program at the School of Public Policy. The Extractive Resources Governance Program works to strengthen legislation, regulation, and policy as it relates to mineral and energy resource development. And an important component of that is engaging Indigenous people in resource development. And so in that capacity, I want to welcome you to today's webinar on Indigenous businesses and procurement, transforming industry engagement. And we are honored and delighted today to have a very distinguished group of panelists to lead us through this important discussion. Our panelists all have rich and deep experience in this area, and we're very much looking forward to them sharing their views. Canada is in the very early stages of its truth and reconciliation journey, and full engagement of Indigenous people in Canada's economic development is an important element of that journey. And this makes this topic an important public policy issue. Guiding us through today's discussion is Dr. Heather Exner-Perot. Dr. Exner-Perot holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies, a Master of Arts in Political Science, and a PhD in Political Science. Her PhD is from the University of Calgary, which makes her one of our own. Since completing her PhD in 2011, Dr. Exner-Perot has worked on a variety of projects, both research and private sector projects, supporting Indigenous economic development in Canada. So she's very well positioned to lead us through this discussion today. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Exner-Perot.
Great, thanks so much, Deborah, for the introduction. I'll just wait to see if my screen will come on here. Well, anyways, it's a delight for us to be here. I'm here in my capacity as a research advisor for the Indigenous Resource Network, and all of my co-panelists are members of the advisory board for the Indigenous Resource Network. And they're all Indigenous and they're all business owners, and they've all been involved in resource development for many years, for all of them, I think for more than a decade. So we had thought that this would be a great conversation to have. This isn't the first conversation that has taken place on procurement and on Indigenous procurement, but we thought that we would want to take that discussion a little bit further and beyond just kind of like it's a nice to do and we should all do Indigenous procurement, and to get into the nuts and bolts of it and talk about what is working, what is happening, what has changed in the last 10 years, what's changed for the better, where there's still gaps, and maybe how can policies evolve even better to better include Indigenous people in resource development. And so with that said, I'm looking for a great discussion. And I'm just going to introduce our panelists that I'm very excited to be here. Our first panelist is John Desjarlais Jr. He's Cree Métis from Cumberland House in northern Saskatchewan. He also has ties to Treaty 4. John started his career back in 2001 in the mining industry. and has worked in a variety of roles. He's also an engineer. He has a degree in mechanical engineering. He also has a master's in business administration, and he has a lifelong lust for learning. So John is also a master's of Northern Governance and Development student at the University of Saskatchewan, and still working on adding those credentials. In Don's day job, he's the general manager of Great Plains Contracting, which is an industrial construction company whose owner is FHQ Developments, which is owned by FHQ File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council in southern Saskatchewan. And he also does a lot of volunteer positions. He's the president-elect of APEGS, the Association of Provincial Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan. And he's also a director or chair of the area of safety for the Construction Safety Association in Saskatchewan, and many other volunteer capacities. So a real leader in construction in Saskatchewan. Our next panelist is Des Dumais. He's the owner of Kihew Fabco and a proud member of Kakowistahau First Nation, also in Treaty 4 in Saskatchewan. Des has over 20 years of experience in oil and gas, predominantly in Northeast BC. But his current company partnership is with his own community. It's a piping and structural steel manufacturing facility. Does a lot of work with pipelines also. And they've just recently, Des has been very busy during the pandemic, not like all of us just here on Zoom, but Des has been everywhere, and they've been developing a fully automated 55,000 square foot fabrication facility in Melville, which is a huge boon for his community. And he just has a really long track record, very positive and constructive relationships with industry. Next, we have Judy Desjarlais. Judy is Beaver and Cree from Blueberry First Nation, located in Treaty 8. She is the president of Top Notch Oilfield Contracting based in Fort St. John. And Judy is also the diversity and inclusion outreach worker at FNLNG Alliance. And Top Notch provides heavy civil, site services, and oilfield services. And last but not least is our friend Mick Morrison. Mick is the founder of Prairie Creek Indigenous Group and a member of the Haida Gwaii. He's a welder, he's a commercial fisher, but he also has decades of experience in the oil and gas and construction industries, including liaison work between Indigenous communities and oil and gas companies. And we had, if you were wondering, we had Shawn McDonald, who's the president of ROBA and also owns Black Scorpion Contracting in Lac La Biche. He was scheduled to come on, and unfortunately, Shawn couldn't make it because he's attending a ceremony to honor the people from the Kamloops Indian Residential School Cemetery and the tragic discovery this week. So Shawn sends his regrets, but certainly that's a more important thing than a webinar, is to pay his respects there. So I'm just going to get right into it and get started on this discussion, which I'm looking forward to. And I'm going to start by asking our four panelists a little bit about themselves, so that you can all learn how you got into industry, what kind of things you've done in the industry, your relationship, and a little bit yourself and your journey. So I'm going to start with you, John, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started with all this.
Thank you, Heather. So So I'm from Cumberland House, northeastern Saskatchewan. I identify as Nanau, Métis, Cree, the N dialect, Métis as well too. And again, as she mentioned, my mother's from northeastern Saskatchewan. My father's from the Quebec Valley, so Treaty 4. And so, I've had an interesting, I think, career in history, educationally, as well as work experience. I think that really informed, I know my perspectives on, engagement, Indigenous engagement, what works, what doesn't work. I spent about 16, 17 years in the mining industry, in particular uranium mining in northern Saskatchewan. From there, moved into economic development for the First Nation from back home. And that evolved into kind of an integration of, my technical experience in industrial, and then combining my business development, business management, public policy work through now with Great Plains Contracting. And so our business is I think it's designed around that impact, and it started to evolve pretty quickly over the last few years. And so you have to ask yourself those fundamental questions. Why do we participate in business? Of course, to see livelihood and to participate in a lot of the economy that happens. But I think there's a greater desire to see, I think, more of a sustainable impact in our activities. So we want to see and participate more meaningfully in the depth of economic or the depth of opportunities and jobs that come through that, the depth of participation in management and governance. So one of the reasons I was really drawn to this organization was because of that leadership, that community leadership, and then that community expectation that at the end of the day, our business is not simply about bottom line, is about profit purely, but it's about wealth from an understanding, and from that Indigenous understanding of community wealth and well-being. And so, our business is certainly inspired to seek a greater impact in the economic or the socioeconomic well-being of the people who participate within our businesses. And so, excited because that's the vision, and my job now is to be able to, I think, flesh out that vision a little more, and then start to execute on that and make, I think, real, meaningful, lasting change. There's been a lot of great things happening. We'll talk about that later today in terms of some of the best practices. How do you ensure that Indigenous people at the end of the day are realizing the full value of procurement, or at least to their greatest extent, where they're driving that. And so, that's a little bit about my history, and I'll certainly love to pass it on to next participant.
All right, thanks so much, Shawn. So the next one, Judy, if you can tell us how you got involved in this industry and what your relationship has been with natural resources for your business.
I'm Judy Desjarlais from Northeast British Columbia. I'm Dumais Kihew First Nation from the Treaty 8 Territory. I started this journey in business with my husband in 2004. And over the years, we've faced many challenges when it comes to procurement and Indigenous engagement. And, from those experiences, I grew a passion, learning stories from my people and asking questions of how do we get involved? How do you guys do it? Well, it takes a few companies. It takes oil and gas companies to really believe in you. And we were fortunate enough to find and work with one of them, which is Petronas Canada. And over the years, we've been with them probably 14, 15 years now, most of our whole business life. And they grew with us. We grew together when it came to learning safety. We've been all the way back then. And learning with them, they're learning with us, teaching each other. And we developed a training program for my people, Blueberry River First Nations, created one. And it was successful. We ended up capturing one of the members who is now a full-time employee for the past 4 years. And, I really like IRN. I joined this group because they have the same passion as I do to have equal opportunity for First Nation businesses. And if they don't, how do we get past that? And how do we engage everyone on an equal platform when it comes to economic opportunity in our resources, where most of the resources are on treaty land or in some communities' backyard. So we have to look past the borders. And with the First Nation LNG Alliance, I'm on with as a diversity and inclusion worker. So we're focused on the project, CGL and TC Energy from Dawson to Kitimat, and ensuring that they have the communities that have signed on with that pipeline have the equal opportunity, the members have the equal opportunity to go to pass the shovel and get the real long-term work. So if they're not engaging or further in their education or getting the proper training to advance their career into these into the pipeline, there's a problem. So I'm happy to be part of that, the diversity and outreach worker for First Nation LNG Alliance, because they have the same goal and commitment and vision as IRN.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Judy. Des, we'll turn over to you next.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate being able to participate in this panel today. As everybody Heather already introduced myself, I'm Des Dumas. I'm a member of the Kakalistow First Nation, Treaty 4, just southeast Saskatchewan. I've worked in the oil and gas industry mainly for the last, since 99. Just started out as a construction worker, laborer, and started my own business in 2005, got into working into the operation and maintenance on large process facilities, then stepped into the construction side of pipeline and facility construction, and then moved into some leadership roles as a facility superintendent. Now I'm now the president of Kihew Fabco. I'm now in business with my own community. We started a large structural steel manufacturing facility, that's going to facilitate opportunities for our community members and help bring jobs, training, and revenue to our community. And I'm really excited to be here today, and I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Des. And last but not least, Mick, if you want to tell us about your journey and how you got involved with industry and what that's looked like for you.
Good morning, everybody. Or afternoon now, I guess. We're an hour behind you out here in BC, but yeah, for me, I'm a member of the Haida Nation. My Haida name is Kwanda and Jagoose. Kwanda means loosely translate in English to gets lots, and Jagoose is the northwest wind. For me, I started out as a commercial fisherman, and I fished, practically most of my life, and ran several different boats, and we fished every species, and bottom shellfish and everything else in the diving industry. So when that started to peter out, I moved. I went up to Fort St. John to hire out as a welder. I had a welding ticket in 1983, so I started putting it to use, welding pipe, and for a hammer company. So we hammered pipe in the ground, surface casing it would be called, for horizontal directional drills. We hammered pipe under roadways, highways, and waterways. And I did that for a number of years. I worked in every province, pretty much in Western Canada and Yukon, Northwest Territories. Went south to Washington, but from there I moved on to work with Enbridge as the Aboriginal liaison, and I stayed with them for about 9 years, and I kind of just moved around within the company, right into pre-quals, and spent a lot of time with the mucky mucks, and so I learned the ropes with them. Des knows that. But anyways, so my mother is Haida and my father's Gitxan, and so Gitxan would bring him from the Hazelton area, and he ended up here on Haida Gwaii, marrying my mother, and so that's the background of our family. But in the early days when I started hammering pipe, I worked for a company called Rampro Casing and Crossing, and the Crossing company came and bought us out. So I worked with them for a number of years. Then it turned hands to Kamloops Augering, and after that, I just moved on to Enbridge, and I've been worked with them. I worked with them on the Woodland Pipeline Project, Athabasca Twinning, Northern Gateway, Line 3, and then I went and worked with cross country equipment rentals for quite a while there, and then that was the introduction that through Des. Thanks for that, Des. And then we started our own company. It was called Prairie Creek Indigenous Group. So we had a number of things going there. We had profit sharing with the Indigenous communities. We looked for manpower, bringing in, the profit sharing that we like to do with the communities. If, they had a piece of equipment that they had in mind to purchase, or say like for our back truck companies, we'd incorporate with them in with the company and rent them out, so that now they have something feasible where they're making money on it. So things like that. And lately I haven't been out in the patch because of COVID, and I've been working with Heather and Arnie and Des and everybody on the IRN, and it's starting to evolve into something great. I think it's going to be at the end of the day. So my introduction. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mick. Thank you to you all. It's great to get this perspective into how you got involved in industry. And I guess I'll jump into my next question. And that's basically the theme, from someone like me, from an academic perspective, where we look at, industry, Indigenous relations. I might say something like, we had the duty to consult, and we've had some Supreme Court decisions, and that resulted in more impact and benefit agreements and more right to, the duty to consult and accommodate and engage. And from that, we have seen tremendous growth. I have seen, you can quantify it, from very little to billions of dollars in procurement. And oil sands, I think we know, have been leaders in that procurement, especially in terms of quantity. But we see it in mining, we see it in hydro, we see it now with electricity. We see it everywhere, that it's no longer a nice to do, it's a need to do. Resource companies need to engage with the communities on whose territories they're on. But I'm curious how this looks like from your perspective. I think we've all heard the story that industry might tell about Indigenous procurement. But what has that looked like for you guys? You've all been in the industry for decades. How have you seen this relationship evolve in the past 10 or 15 years? And I might go in the same order for this question, and I'll mix it up after that. So John, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you, Heather. And so, yeah, my perspective, it's certainly, fascinating. So my perspective, I was a part of that operations group, operator interest. And so when we talk about clients and procuring, I was on that inside, right? And so develop a lot of experience, work with a lot of Indigenous businesses, as they evolved, move forward, a couple steps back, 4 steps forward, whatever. But then kind of, and getting involved on the service side now over the last couple of years with Great Plains Contracting. And there's a lot of things in there. You've seen there was some quick movements, I think, over 20, 30 years in terms of starting to establish procurement policies. And, the threshold was set. And so I think what people thought of was, what qualifies as Indigenous business? What makes it Indigenous? And we start to understand that. And the other part to it is participation. And so we were asked, what does it look like in terms of Indigenous labor as a total overall value of overall labor hours? And so we looked at hours and we looked at Indigenous businesses. And so things have evolved, probably not to a point where I think it should be. And that's the point of the discussion today. But, and what that did is that there was a lot of impact to that. A lot of jobs were created. And so a lot of businesses were created, a lot of Indigenous communities started to participate in the economy in that way. But, I guess on the flip side of that, it did not incentivize, I think, deeper relationships or behaviors that were more impactful to Indigenous communities. So you look at 2 of those low thresholds, labor hours. What happened was Indigenous people, as Judy mentioned, on the goon spoons, right, on shovels, entry level. And so when we looked at just hours, organizations went for the low hanging fruits. And so we flooded and hit engagement targets based off of entry level positions. And so procurement didn't reflect or incentivize greater participation or training of Indigenous people necessarily. And so they didn't look at the depth of Indigenous participation in these projects or these operations. They didn't incentivize or reward. Do you have Indigenous, in construction? Do you have project managers, estimators, quality, safety? And then, did you have supervisors? And there was no incentive through procurement for that. On the other ownership side, I think it's no coincidence that a majority of Indigenous partnerships are 51%, 49%, right? All hit that threshold from a variety of different business structures. And so, and that was kind of it, industry set that as the expectation, it defined that. And then, it's like I said, it's no surprise. Whereas a lot of these partnerships are managed by, capacity partners or the non-Indigenous partners. And so there's, I guess that Indigenous participation and progressive, it's different in different areas. There's some much more progressive. But yeah, again, procurement didn't really reflect or incentivize deeper engagement. So they didn't incentivize things like governance participation. Does your organization have its own independent board? And is there deep participation of Indigenous people on it? Management participation is another thing, we didn't see. So they didn't incentivize, does your management structure reflect deep participation of Indigenous people? And if it doesn't, are you doing anything to develop those discrepancies? And then, going back to the labor side, we're not, we should be looking at things like labor dollars versus labor hours, right? Procurement should say, okay, what's the total labor dollars spent versus overall labor dollars spent? That way, I think organizations are more incentivized to be able to ensure that there's Indigenous participation deeper within, the execution plans of construction or whatever business model it may be. Those are some of the responses to kind of the threshold, but I think there's a deeper there's a deeper need and there's a deeper desire to see and to drive more of those dollars, procurement dollars, towards the Indigenous community. And so we're operate within, a capitalistic environment. And so people are always trying to seek ways in which they can maximize profit and the partners, and, no blame to that type of activity. But clients are starting to ask for a little more in terms of engagement and procurement. And so that's what I've seen. I worked in an environment where I got to see this in action. And so an organization that reflected and looked at its Indigenous or Northern participation and saw that there's a disproportionate number of people at the entry level side. And so how do I, where's my sense of where this is coming from? I was able to participate in education and training and development opportunities to move me from that entry level or junior position to more senior and managerial. So organizations are spending the money to do that, and that's reconciliation before reconciliation was really a thing, right? And so people are looking to see deeper participation. Organizations are looking to see deeper engagement and participation, as opposed to just simply working the metrics. The metrics have to change to reflect greater impact to Indigenous people.
Thanks, John. We could just follow up on that for an hour. And one thing I always have a question, and maybe the others will build on this, but it's good that procurement policies are specific, obviously, because that's what companies need to get things done and to measure. So things like saying you need to be 51% Indigenous owned. But on the flip side of that, now all you have is a bunch of 51% Indigenous company. It also created a box and limited something. So there's a flip side to all of these. There's unintended consequences sometimes to all the ways that we negotiate these policies. But anyways, thanks so much. Judy, I'll move to you. How have you seen this evolve in the last 10 years? And what has that meant for your business and for your involvement?
In the procurement stages, I'm going to say, I have to agree with John, things have gotten better when it comes to, involvement from First Nation companies. In the last little while, we've seen oil companies reach out to business owners and communities because they have to engage. That's where true reconciliation comes in. In the past, it wasn't always easy because you had to know the right people, to get in front of the right people, to pitch your sale. And it was a hard learning experience to get past the procurement stages before you're even involved into a project. Now it's changing where First Nations are managing the projects. In some First Nations are doing a great job and benefiting and creating economic development careers for their people because there's transparency. There's a lot of transparency happening in those communities. Some of them we don't always see, we don't always see that kind of opportunity in areas we work in. So it's hard to get past the stage of going around in circles of, okay, you need this to go to work. Here's what's your safety requirements, past that, get on the bid list. Well, it's even hard to get on the bid list. So right now what I'm seeing is that times have changed, but there is still room for improvement when it comes to engaging First Nations, because the transparency is the real truth to reconciliation when it comes to economic development in Treaty 8 or any territory.
Thanks, Judy. I think you've raised two important points that we need to build on. One is, the business and the politics. And when IBAs are negotiated with nations, what does that mean for businesses and for entrepreneurs? So I think, there's a lot to think about and still a lot to develop in that. And the other one, what was the other one? You said another thing that I'll think of it later, but yeah, just on the evolution. But I'll get to it later. I should have written it down, Judy, but you piqued my interest. So, but we'll move on.
It's the political narrative. I'm going to say it. It's the political narrative that has to change when it comes to Indigenous engagement and economic opportunity. True transparency and true reconciliation comes when it's all across on the table, members are involved, then you know the First Nations are truly benefiting because it's in their backyard. Here's the opportunity that's there. We are rich in resources, and my people should be thriving on any opportunities that's there, especially when it comes to oil and gas, LNG. You know, lots of mining, forestry. You know, there's a lot of training dollars. There's a lot of training companies that they can train our people to advance on to the next stage.
Thanks, Judy. And now I remember what I was going to say. You talked about the process of becoming competitive in a procurement policy. And I know that like there's a lot, I don't think people appreciate, certainly if you're not in the business like me, all the hurdles that you have to climb just to become competitive in a bid, and the upfront costs you need to become competitive in a bid. And lots of First Nations businesses and people don't have access to the credit or the support or the family loans to get them into a place where they can be competitive. And so, Arnie Bellis, who we all know, he often talks about, First Nations are missing the first rung in the ladder. So how can we, help put that first rung in the ladder so that people can be competitive in the bid in the first place, before any dollars are exchanged. So Des, let's move on to you. What have you seen, in your experience and the evolution? What has that meant for your participation?
Well, I think that, the laws that changed in 2015 in BC, really set a precedence of how rights and title were a part of the equation and how that was left behind for many years. I think that there's a lot more willingness to work with Indigenous businesses and communities, and at the end of the day, mutually benefiting and working together is, the way forward. We can always look back on the past and historical data of how industry was participating or was allowing Indigenous communities and businesses to participate. But I think they're doing such a great job moving forward. I think that the resource sector really needs to. A lot of people can learn from how companies like TC Energy have put together a reconciliation action plan. I think that that says a lot about that company and how they operate in the traditional territories of their operations. I think companies like I have like Enbridge, they do a lot to include and send a lot of people out in their organization to work with the communities at a very high level. And I think the smaller operators, they can learn a lot from how these companies really engage the communities. So they're very progressive in their Indigenous engagement strategies, and I think a lot of people can learn from that. We don't really always have to reinvent the wheel, but really look at how, the resource sector is doing trying to do a better job and work with our communities.
So Des, what would be in TC Energy's reconciliation action plan that you think has had an impact? What does that look like?
Well, the fact that they would, publicly put that out there for Indigenous communities to see that, there's a way forward together. I think, the document has so much information and how they have a plan, but again, the plan to reconcile, what's happened and how we can move together forward. I think that just having a plan in general is your first step in actually just identifying where a lot of businesses and organizations and industry may fall short. I think just being a leader and how, that you have a plan and that you want to publicly share that with everybody and all the communities is a really great first step.
Awesome, thanks. And then finally, Mick, this was actually your job. It was you're part of the guy that evolved things, certainly with Enbridge, and to change the ways that this works. So, what did you do, or what did you see, or what did you encounter when Enbridge was, I guess, changing its ways and being more progressive in that way?
Well, in the early days, I was, for me, as the liaison, I started out in Fort McMurray on the Woodland Pipeline project. And, there it was hard to get anybody to work, because everybody that wanted a job had a job because there was so much hustle and bustle there in Fort Mac. But, in the early days, then you didn't see very many First Nation people pipelining either. So it was kind of my job to muster up workers, and I did. You know, I got 180 Indigenous people come on board on the pipeline, and we had 400 kilometers of pipe to put in, 36-inch pipe from Curl to Cheecham. And it wasn't an easy task because, you know, the other pipeliners weren't used to having so many Indigenous people on there. So there was a lot of problems every day. You know, we're putting out fires. We had to fire people because of it. But, you know, once they learn that there's going to be, you know, you're going to get punished for your treatment of the people, you know, any of the workers, that when they learn, everybody kind of followed in line. So it gradually got easier. And, you know, towards the end of the project, there wasn't so much feuding. But the biggest thing there was inclusion, you know, and we're trying to build Indigenous partners that, you know, where there's going to be some continuity. And, you know, we tried to give out as much work as we could to the Indigenous people with clearing the right of ways and everything. And it worked really well. And, you know, at the end of the day, for the woodland, we had 33% inclusion. And, you know, that was like a huge milestone. And I don't think you could find another pipeline that had that much participation today. But, you know, and then I worked with Athabasca Twinning Pipeline. And then again, it was still my duty to get the Indigenous people to work and equipment and companies. And I kind of set the table for that. You know, we had 150 new Indigenous people come on board on that pipeline. So compounded with the ones we already had from woodland, you know, it's bringing a lot of money back into the communities, But not just from making the money on the pipeline, but when you go home, you're an EI, you're in the union. Now you could just phone the hall and get on the dispatch board, and you could kind of pick and choose your job. So, you know, some people need their trapping time or their powwow time. So you could pretty much select your time slots and still provide for your family. A lot of people that, you know, continued with the work. It was great. A lot of them still message me today. You know, I got about, I don't know, 3,000 contacts on my phone from, you know, most of them are from pipelining. And they message me all the time telling me they bought new homes or cars or campers or whatever. But that was the big thing, was, you know, getting over that hurdle. But on things have changed. Like last time I went out on line 3, I was in Manitoba on the last spread there from right down to Gretna station by the border. But, you know, then I had some junior inspectors that was overseeing monitors, senior monitor, junior monitors. And, you know, the times changed from 2011, you know, right till we had our own trailer, the Indigenous trailer. So that was pretty great, you know, got our own parking spots there. So, you know, it evolved. And I think that the biggest thing was the inclusion. You know, Enbridge, they wanted it, and they hired the people to get them there. And at the end of the day, that was our job. And, you know, for me, that was a big thing for me to do that, because you know, Indigenous people have not had the same opportunity. But it was a lot of push and shove in the beginning, but you know, it smoothed out towards the end. I think things are pretty successful now. You know, there's not so much picking on each other. They got other people to pick on now. So thanks.
John, did you want to add to that? You're muted. $2 in the mute jar, John.
Oh, the mute jar. Yeah, I hope I'm not buying this whole group around. So, no, before I think we leave topic, there's a really important piece here, and it's starting to come out. You know, and I guess I feel really bad for procurement professionals, right? In a sense that there's this mixing or meddling of politics, right, within what is intended to be established best practice, right? There's process, protocol around, understanding best value, best price. There's a lot of science to procurement. And so, I think this complexity is really, it's caused a lot of frustration, and it's probably even caused some issue of disengagement with why are we doing this, right, and buying this, and even some perceptions on Indigenous businesses as gougers or incapable or all these things. But I think one of the things we really need to think about, and it's been a blessing and a little bit of a curse, is as we started to evolve duty to consult, the piece that comes to that, as we consult, we accommodate. So we identify the impacts of our resource development decisions on rights, and then we think about the accommodation to help either to mitigate some of those impacts. And that's starting to get mixed into, and that's the politics side that's starting to get mixed into procurement. And so, and that's the unfortunate thing that I think is confusing a lot of things. And so we think about accommodation, so impact benefit agreements and a lot of those things. So resource developers need to think about their operations and the impacts of those communities have, and they need to accommodate for those and design things. But I think we need to think about procurement a little bit differently and almost separately. And so procurement should be an instrument of economic reconciliation. It should be an instrument, a way in which organizations can engage the community, not simply because of the accommodation piece or the legal side of things, but a way to meaningfully develop capacity, meaningfully engage these businesses. And I think what we're finding out, especially with the Indigenous business and Indigenous community, is that it's not even like a social imperative anymore. It's an economic imperative. Demographics are changing so fast across Canada. The Indigenous population is rising, 5 times faster than the non-Indigenous population. And so as business, generally, we need to get our talent and our labor somewhere. And if we're not engaging and addressing a lot of these socioeconomic issues with Indigenous people as Canadians, as Canada, then we're really putting ourselves at an economic disadvantage, because baby boomers, people moving out and things like that. We really need to address those labor shortages we are going to see. And Indigenous businesses and buying Indigenous businesses makes sense because we're in the best position to develop that talent. And so we're just naturally much more inclusive, involved and engaging. We prioritize it as a function of our values. So, it's actually, we are best value in a lot of ways, and we are good for the economy. We're good for, other businesses in line with what we're doing, what other businesses doing. But yeah, I think that was important to mention, our procurement ideas of procurement need to change. We need to pull out the politics and the accommodation piece. Think about why we're doing this in the spirit of reconciliation. Why does our business engage in this? And I think it'll make it much clearer for procurement professionals in terms of what is process, what should it look like, what are the outcomes of this, and why are we doing it?
I mean, there's so much there, John. And I think when you're thinking about procurement and IBAs and MBAs and all those things, I mean, there's the duty to consult and accommodate. And then there's, the community needs benefits, and then the company needs labor. And then individuals need, to build capacity and have opportunity themselves. And they're, and I guess every procurement policy might have to privilege one or more of those, rank those differently. But, try to, tick the box on all those too in the end of the day. And so I think that, works well into going into our next question. We'll get into audience questions here, pretty soon also, so you can start submitting those. But thinking about all the things that an Indigenous business has to confront, and it's starting with, just building capacity to be able to compete, to be able to bid. And then, the workforce, like as Mick said, there's some development needed to get a workforce in place, to have Indigenous people ready to go and have all the tickets that they need and have the transportation that they need and have the opportunities that are, have back home taken care of so they can go work somewhere. And then there's, the barriers that you face, whether, through prejudice or racism as an Indigenous business, that other people might treat you differently or look at you differently or put you in a box and not give you maybe the full gamut of opportunities that a non-Indigenous business would have. So maybe we'll start with you, Des, and we'll ask everyone, what are the challenges that you see that you face as an Indigenous business that you don't see that, a non-Indigenous business would have to face in the same way?
I think one of the biggest challenges is, getting your foot in the door with a lot of these companies. when you don't have those long-term, long-standing relationships with these, with the procurement, the companies that are providing the procurement opportunities, that's a, when you don't have that long-standing track record, that you do, and again, also maybe the metrics on how they measure, how you're going to, how the procurement's going to be divvied out. You can't compare a 50-year business, it's like a structural steel company that's been in business for 50 years versus a company that's like ours that's been in for 2 years. We're heavily developed in automation, and we're integrating as much as we can the fastest, best softwares and tools and equipment. But again, if you don't have the opportunity to build on that, to build on those foundations, I mean, that's what I see one of the biggest hurdles is just, getting the exposure and being able to participate at a very high level. And then again, but I can say though that, we're developing some really good relationships with some of those businesses. And I think, as we move forward, those things are going to, come forefront, that people are going to see that, we can be competitive just like everybody else. So.
That's a great point, Des. And I think if you're not in the industry, you don't think about it, that, there's a lot of established relationships, and maybe, 90% of a job is already, they already know who they're going to parse it out to. And so some of the new Indigenous businesses are just competing, with kind of the margins of what's still available. So, Judy, how about you? What are some of the challenges you guys have faced?
Oh boy, it's hard to get in the door. And once you're in the door and you meet with your First Nation liaison and take you for a walk around the street, or buy you a cup of coffee, feed you a line and say, we'll get back to you. Then you don't hear from them. How do you, and you keep calling and you can't get past that stage. When you finally get past the stage, well, you only have one piece of equipment. That's where, that's where the oil companies, the industry can work with the First Nations people to get them at the next level. Okay, well, this business is growing. I'm not going to give them the shovel anymore. I'm now going to say, okay, go get another piece. We're going to work with you. This is how we're going to transpire into engaging First Nation businesses to start working at an equal opportunity place with industry. For the longest time, we started out as manpower, and we had from 50 to 150 people saw hands for seismic. Then with the money with the money we generated in there, we advanced ourselves into buying equipment, small equipment. Then the bigger equipment came, and then it was hard to build a relationship with a few of the other oil companies, because it's they never really believed in us, I guess, until we mattered to one or more, and they were able to work with us. But a lot of the political narrative has to change in that capacity too, because you're not only supposed to deal with the chief and the chief only. You have a whole community to deal with and get the opportunity out there. There's business people that are members. There's business people that the members are business workers, like welders. There's truckers. Oil and gas sister was one of the first women to complete an oil and gas operator training, and AltaGas, or ConocoPhillips and AltaGas, hired her full-time until she became an elected official. She put her career on hold to be a leader, to try and change some of the dialogue where there is no equal opportunity, and be a voice for the people.
Awesome. Thanks, Judy. Mick, I'll let you finish this round off. What are the challenges you face as an Indigenous person, as an owner of an Indigenous business, and what have you seen other people? What are the barriers that you have seen in your days?
For me, I heard it said already, is the racism. Of course, there's as Judy says, there's a lack of engagement, a lack of continuity, and the work opportunities are usually small potatoes, eh? But I see that's evolving now that, they're getting more lucrative contracts and they're getting behind you. They're trying to create some continuity because generally when they go through your traditional territory, but they're done with you. But now they see you as an asset because any amount of Indigenous participation is good for the industry because it kind of gives them a gold star, but they do that to non-Indigenous companies. I worked with Enbridge for 9 years, and I've seen lots of companies that weren't Indigenous at the table every year on different projects. So it can't be project driven. That continuity has to be for all the work to make a successful business relationship, a true one. And I think they're striving for that now, and it's really helping. For like Northern Gateway, I'd seen somebody asking about what the profit sharing was, but on Northern Gateway, right from Bruderheim to Heisla, there was $10 million worth of contracts for every community that signed up. So you're Aboriginal equity partner. And then you become a shareholder of the pipeline. And Coastal are going to develop a marine emergency response where you're going to be the owner operators. And just to what Judy was saying, that every pipeline is different. And for Enbridge, I know they didn't expect you to own equipment because you can't just have that equipment sitting around not working. If it's idle, not making money, you still got to make payments on there. So they'd like to give contracts out so that, when then you could go get your equipment, whether you lease it or purchase it. And that's why the continuity was really important, because you can't just let the company fail. And that was one of Enbridge's things. It was a policy that we're not going to let the Indigenous business fail. Thanks.
Thanks, Mick. You brought up one interesting point, and we'll move to our next question on it. Is that I know there's a debate between Indigenous and local representation in workforce and contracts. And just to open up this, this whole thing, our last question before I move to audience questions was, how will you guys change or improve procurement policies to ensure Indigenous businesses can compete and succeed? And John, you mentioned a few at the beginning and a few others have come up, but what does a good, what does an ideal policy look like? Or what are you seeing that works, that's working for both industry and for the First Nations business that they're procuring from? I'll start with you, John, because I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, and then we'll get to everyone.
Absolutely, for sure. I'll try to keep it brief. So I mentioned a few of those things, right? Labor dollars and ownership, to look at that. Some of the things I've seen, some of the more progressive policies look a little deeper. They want to see participation or investment in community, investment in capacity development or training of Indigenous people. I think some of the ones that ask some of those questions and that reward that behavior of procurement, I think some of the ones are more, certainly more progressive. Some of the challenges we see and some of the opportunities, the organizations, sole source is a very contentious word, right? And so it's viewed by the non-Indigenous business community as favoritism. And I've heard it best explained. It's not a handout; it's a hand up. And so it's an instrument and a tool that allows, I think, organizations to address a lot of the competitive issues we talked about. So one of the problems is meritocracy, right? And so we assume we, as procurement professionals, generally want our businesses to compete. They want our prices to come in, similar or on par with the general market. But without reflecting that a lot of the businesses we compete have been established. They own a lot of equipment. They've been buying and selling over a lot longer period of time than we have. Their ability to compete is much, more defined. You look at a lot of the ownership structures in our businesses, there's a more of a wealth distribution, right? We have a lot of owners in some of our businesses. And so there's an understanding there to create that impact. It's really tough to meet those expectations of those communities. when you're competing with a, quote unquote mom and pop shop, right? And so low overhead, low resources, people who've been doing it for a long time, who can have cross-functional responsibilities, where our businesses we're trying to build them, and they're typically layered, and we don't have necessarily those people who've been working in those spaces. So organizations, I think, that understand that and that engage in direct sourcing, sole sourcing, especially to businesses that are open, transparent, and committed to a lot of the things we talked about. So ensuring a great degree of value goes back to the Indigenous people, I think, are some of the more progressive, tactics and activities we've seen. There's some organizations that just won't do it, right? No, we're public, we can't do that sole sourcing. But the pitch is always, well, it's actually in your best interest, right? It's not certainly, it's to reflect those discrepancies. It's, our businesses, we spend more, I think, and I know we do, we're more engaging. We spend more on development, on people, our disciplinary processes, bereavement processes, a lot of that are a lot more inclusive. And, what does that mean? That means costs. We don't think about, like I said, we think about employee well-being a little differently. So, HR policy, maybe 2-3 days direct family. We're looking at things like extended family and more days, right? And then cultural days, ceremony, people to practice, things like that. And what does that mean at the end of the day? That impacts bottom line, right? And so as a community-based business with expectations, so the expectation for us to compete price to price is a challenge. It's a huge challenge for us. And again, everyone mentioned access to capital, right? Another big barrier. And so, especially for some of the proprietors in the room, right? Some of the smaller groups, leveraging assets, what kind of assets, how do they get that? Huge barrier to entry for them, especially if you're on reserve, right? What do you leverage in that regard? So yeah, there's absolutely a lot of challenges. Organizations that understand this and work past it and work with our businesses in honest, transparent ways with humility, I think is more the progressive relationships I've seen. I'm really happy. There's a lot of organizations, a lot of people who get it, but there's just as much or as many people who, I think could use that education and understand how to do things a little differently.
Thanks, John. Who wants to go next? How do we change or evolve procurement policies so that Indigenous businesses can be more successful? All right, Mick, I can tell that you're ready with an answer there.
Okay. I just thought somebody was going to leap in there, but I heard John say it and a few others, 51% ownership, and that has to be verified too. Like when I was working as the liaison, we verified that, because there's always secret deals. They'll give you a percentage, say 51%, and you'll get 3 to 5% on the back. But that never worked, and it doesn't really truly impact the Indigenous communities that way. So what we did, what I did too, is I pushed to have that verified, and then any other companies that came in, first you have to have all Indigenous participants. Some of it's specialized work, so you bring those people in as well, and and then if you had other companies coming to the project, they had to have a Indigenous participation plan to get, some of the workforce there. We have a lot of specialized workers there now. And so the fit is good, everybody's pipelining is pretty lucrative, and not so much out here in terrestrial BC and coastal BC, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other provinces. But that's one of the biggest things, I think, in follow up. Say if the client, whatever the client might be, it could be Enbridge or TransCanada. If they want something done, and the inclusion, they say specifically they want, the Indigenous people have these opportunities. Sometimes when it tumbles down to the contractor, they give it out to their friends or their family, because been in the racket for years, and that's what they did. They always carried them around, whether it was aggregate or first aid or whatever it might be. But so I think you know, one of the things is that they're going to have a mechanism there for follow through, and you know, to ensure that the Indigenous will get that true opportunity, and not just the low hanging fruit, because you know, that was one of the things that they gave out in the early days, but you know, from my experience, it's bigger and better, and the longevity of the work, they want to make you a success, so they got to get behind you just like everybody else.
Awesome. Thanks, Mick. Des, I'm going to have a specific question for you, and then Judy, I'll turn to you too. But there's 2 questions from the audience talking about kind of the geography of procurement. And the observation is that Northern BC, Northern Alberta, Northern Saskatchewan, we've probably seen more progressive, more successful procurement policies, maybe just given the territory and the demographics. And Des, I know that you've done work, you know, in Northern BC, in the Squamish territory, and now in Treaty 4 around Kakawistahau. Can you tell me a little bit about the differences you see in attitudes and opportunities based on just basic geography?
Yeah, there is definitely some differences. If you work down in the Lower Mainland, you know, the Indigenous community, you know, very well recognized and very much a part of all development that's down in the Lower Mainland, and has been for quite some time. You know, as we move up in Northeast BC, you know, you've seen a big change in the last 5 years. You know, how First Nations and industry work together, and you look at all that success now that they're having out on the BC coast, you know, how major projects are moving ahead and how people are working together. You know, again, working in Saskatchewan, you know, there definitely is, they're working together and things are moving ahead. I just think that there's a lot more, we can learn a lot from what's happened in BC, you know, and I think that you know, how we move forward in Saskatchewan, you know, we could take a lot from, you know, the history of how, you know, the success that we're having out there, I think is a good way to look at it.
Yeah, thanks. And now, Judy, we have 2 questions also talking about, you know, private Indigenous contractors versus nation-owned companies. And I know this is, you know, personal to you in your territory. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, what are your thoughts on how nation-owned businesses can work with entrepreneur-owned businesses so that everyone can be successful and so there isn't disadvantages for individual entrepreneurs?
I think transparency and a policy from the oil and gas companies to these proponents or these partnerships, and data collection, like Mick said, 51% or the majority of the First Nation people is capable of working in the industry should be thriving right now. It has to get past the political narrative in order to create real opportunity for the First Nations people. And real opportunity comes through truth and reconciliation. And, you know, honesty goes a long ways and creates success. At the end of the day, the people are always going to be there in their communities, in their backyards is going to be developed, but they should be part of the development when it comes to LNG, oil and gas. And, you know, I think it'll go a long ways if the oil companies change the policy of the narrative, and inclusion has to be held with proper policy and procedure to follow with partnerships.
Thanks, Judy. I see, John, that you have some thoughts on this. You're muted.
Oh, I can't afford this webinar. So, no, I just some quick thoughts. You know, one of the things I think that frustrates me is, you know, I hate seeing the politics of large community-owned businesses push out proprietors, right? And you know, I think we're working on a solution to hopefully address that in Saskatchewan with an organization of Indigenous construction businesses. And so we're trying to understand, like, how do private interest, Indigenous interest, and community interest reconcile, right? How do they exist in the same space? How do we look to support each other as opposed to compete and then push out and even, you know, further repress or marginalize proprietors or Indigenous owned proprietors? And so one of the ways we're doing that is through impact. And so there's community-based businesses that don't necessarily have the economic impact that proprietors have. So proprietors might have more Indigenous people, greater depth of Indigenous people. They might give back more to community. And so they might actually be achieving more of an economic impact than a community business. And so we're working towards language around that, understanding that. And so at the end of the day, those private entrepreneurs can get rewarded, I guess, for their activity. Because we roll back, we're not trying to advocate on the interest of community or private, we're trying to advocate in the interest of the individual or the Indigenous person and the Indigenous community members. If we think down at that level, like then we get past those differences, right? And we can start to talk about, are we creating jobs, deep engagement, involving Indigenous people more meaningfully? Are we giving more back to community? And so we're hoping to have more language or a solution on that.
Thanks, John. Des, I'm curious about your experience. You've been in, your own business owner for a couple of decades, and now you started working with your own nation, Kakawistahau. What have been the differences? What are the different considerations that you have to take into account?
Well, when you're working with your community, I think, that needs to be put first, is like, what are the needs for our community? And, how do we bring that to the table on a larger scale of just being a business? We have 2,600 band members, and we're surrounded by numerous First Nation communities. And how do we operate as a business that can, be a place that, we can open up the door for a lot of the other communities to participate. So, I think that's a big message that we always try to get across, that how do we be more impactful? Just like John said, what is the bigger impact, and how, being, how in the procurement process, corporations to look at our companies as a real good way to go down that path of economic reconciliation. I think that, when they can look at the broader picture, and, I think that, like that last question, through policy change, education in their business models, I think that needs to be recognized. The Canadian energy regulator, they did it on a large scale. They, in an interview, her name was Jatan De Silva. She was the regulator CEO, and she acknowledged that there was systemic racism in their organization, and and they want to fix that. So I think, when you look at how you can impact a community on a large scale, and you look at the Indigenous businesses that are out there trying to, do that, and not just bottom line, that we're more invested in training in our community members and help bring revenue, jobs, training, and, opportunities for the communities. I think that that's a big piece of the procurement that needs to be identified. And I think that that's really important. So hope that answers.
Thanks, Des. We have one question here from Deborah on what should be the role, what could be the role that government can play in Indigenous procurement. Do you guys see a role for more government policy or legislation or compelling businesses, and what might that look like? John, I'll start with you, John, and then Mick, if you can get your brain turning on that.
All right, absolutely. Certainly they could play a role. Territorial governments, federal governments, even federal within their own procurements, right? And so we've seen already, there's certainly increase in targets and spend, through the good work of JP at the time, and CCAB showed that there is capacity to deliver on that, exceed that, right? And so we're setting targets of 5%. There's no problem that Indigenous businesses should be able to hit that. Territorial, absolutely. I was really excited, but also disheartened to see the advancement and movement, in the Yukon in regards to their procurement policy. The language around it talked about impact, and it talked about depth. And of course, unfortunately, it was challenged, right, by the non-Indigenous community right now, I think even legally and in courts. And so disheartening. I think more work needs to be done in terms of expressing or detailing how is this best for all of Canada, the market, and everything like that. Like I said, we've moved past social responsibility. It should be in the spirit of economic reconciliation, but it's absolutely an economic imperative for Canada, right? If we continue to historically repress Indigenous people, then we won't have the labor, the talent that our economy needs to grow and to move. If we don't engage our people in more meaningful ways, through education and inclusive education, respective of that knowledge and stuff like that, then we'll continue to repress and marginalize Indigenous people, so we can't participate in a lot of these activities. And if we can't participate, we're going to challenge them, because that's what we seek at the end of the day. We seek, absolutely, we love the development of resources, and the fact that we get to develop them that are reflective of our values, aligned with sustainability, that we get to participate in those decisions, address those, understand those risks and impacts. But yeah, we've done a lot over the last, in my working experience, 20 years and even before that, but I think we need to get over some hurdles over the short term to address a lot of the issues that we'll all be experiencing, with labor shortages and capacity shortages in the market.
Thanks. And I might just rephrase this question a little bit for the rest of you. And as John mentioned, CCAB has been critical to this, but the federal government has announced a 5% Indigenous procurement target, but they're nowhere near, reaching it yet. And I do find it interesting that the resource sector is so much more advanced, has done the work and has had more success in engaging with Indigenous businesses for their procurement. And the federal government now, I think, is starting to see, it's not easy. There's work that needs to be done. So what are your guys' thoughts on, first of all, why is the resource sector, better, the best, I would say, of any sector in Indigenous procurement? And what could governments, whether it's provincial or municipal or federal or territorial governments, be doing, to improve their procurement and their engagement with Indigenous business? Mick?
I heard John say training. Training is one of the key things, and from my experience, the government, we had the work, and we brought the workers, to the job site, but some of the workers didn't have the money to get there, but they'd go to whatever agency and they'd give them money for their boots and their cold weather clothing, and we supplied them with all their hard hats, all the safety gear. But as far as training, they spend a lot of money training on heavy equipment, but one of our policies was that we didn't recommend it, because you go to a training center, it's not specific to pipeline. So when we had a seat open or a machine sitting idle, we had the oilers, which were usually that's the entry level, and they'd come in and they got to run the machine. They get used to breaking up the flow of the hydraulics and get comfortable with the machine until they're at a point where you could actually be dispatched as an operator of some sort. But so that was it's huge to go to take heavy equipment. It's probably about 25 grand minimum. But so the government didn't really have too much input into that part of it. There was a lot of courses out there, but they weren't recommended, and the union wasn't happy with it. The union wanted you to come and train with the union, not with all these companies that sprung up, and they just teach you how to run a machine, but you don't really know what you're doing. So it's kind of really specific work for the unions and for the pipeline construction companies. And so a lot of the training was seat time on the job, and it saved a lot of money. But they had their goods and their bads. They provided an avenue for the workers to get to the job site, which everybody was grateful. That I'm just going to point out one of the things John was talking about there. Industry is trying to, they're making more friends with the Indigenous communities now, and participation level has really gone up, and I'm pretty sure Judy and Desmond could speak to that too. But that's because the Indigenous people are the resistance, and you got to take the path of the least resistance, and that's by making you a true industry partner, and then you'll have some success in that. But that's my thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Mick. Yes, Judy, any thoughts on how, how we can translate those success from the resource sector into other sectors or into government?
Heather, I think that, their willingness to support Indigenous poverty reduction is a big one. I think, the part of, like, they want to be part of the Indigenous community's success. So I think that, we really can look to that model and see how successful that's working with a lot of the major projects that are happening right now. That's kind of my thoughts on that. I think, the provincial government, they can help create a level of impact, where all sectors are progressive and inclusive. I think, when you look to, like Petronas, like Judy said, and Petronas and, Enbridge and TC Energy, they're actively doing these things and they're having a lot of success. So I think, that's my thoughts. So.
Thanks, Des. Judy?
I think the Indigenous training is one of the things that I think would benefit the communities and the governments together, because they they'll be creating jobs, the employment rate will go down, unemployment rate will go down, not higher, and proper procurement for our MPs. But right now, like, we take the Wet'suwet'en Nation, for instance, the blockade that it took for them to even listen to the problems that was potentially there. It's not my place to say, but just looking on the outside and looking in, it took a blockade all across Canada to say, hey, we have a problem here. We haven't been properly consulted, and if they're going to want to do this truth and reconciliation, policies need to be created where they have proper procedure to engage in First Nation communities on all the resources, beyond resources, and actually bring them to the economic table. And the communities, everything has to be transparent. And when you create policies from a government standpoint, you're actually listening to the people when it's out there right now that, it took that blockade for them to listen. And now more and more Indigenous engagement is happening. And there is companies creating policy that, okay, how many people do we have working? There's companies out there working and creating jobs for people, which are long-term, which is great. That's all we wanted, is communication, an equal opportunity, and to hear what's going to benefit the community, we just don't want to be a check mark. And you've done your due diligence, you've got your gas, you got your oil, you've got your LNG, and you're done. Too bad, so sad for everybody else that had to watch all of the activity happen. And we're just going to go with the BCR. Well, it's beyond the BCR, because now you're affecting the people. You're not helping them, you're affecting them by not doing proper procedure and policy.
Thanks, Judy. And for some of our audience, the BCR is a band council resolution. So she means, going beyond just getting that, paper consent and actually doing the work of engagement. So we're almost at the end of the session. So I'm just going to ask you, each of you, maybe to answer this in one last minute, your kind of concluding thoughts, but also to end on a high note is one of the questions we got was about metrics. How do we measure this? And I guess my question for you guys is, why is this important? Why is Indigenous procurement important? What are the outcomes that you see and that you want to see? And John, I'll start with you.
There we go. So just stretching. Yeah, okay. So it aligns with another question that was asked, right? Absolutely. Line of sight in terms of value of procurement dollars, right? And so some of the metrics we need to start to understand. I'm really fortunate to work with an exciting group that is aspiring, and actually not aspiring, but working towards understanding this. What is the impact of those dollars, right? And even going deeper. So defining Indigenous economic impact. So you buy a company and understand what a percentage of that dollar on that spend is actually impacting Indigenous, organizations. So like salaries paid, Indigenous governance retainers paid, community donations, investment in the development. So that's like the impact side. We're actually seeking to understand too, what's the socioeconomic impact of those dollars, right? And so as we buy Indigenous, starting to understand how does that influence well-being, some productivity, retention, things like employee engagement. And so, you query an employee or an entry-level employee, is it meaningful to have Indigenous participation and management for them, right? Do they feel more included? Do they feel there's more opportunity? Do they feel, that they can, I think, participate more meaningfully? So people are starting to understand this a little better and starting to quantify that. And that, we hope, is the tool that we provide back to procurement professionals to say, this is the value of doing business with an Indigenous company, not just from the economic or the pure fiscal side, but here's even some of the socioeconomic benefits, well-being factors and stuff like that. But yeah, we need to move in that direction, because unfortunately, through simple transactions saying we bought an Indigenous business, but then it's a partnership or a JV, so the JV partner might be managing that entire operation. So there might be a small incremental marketing fee, or I'll say it, rent a feather fee that goes back to the Indigenous community. So this impact is small, right? And I think as community members, we want to see transparency on that too. We want to see greater value come back to our communities, and so I think, generally welcome and celebrate opening that up and seeing that more transparent. But those are some of the things we should start to measure and start to look at through procurement.
Thanks. Judy, in a minute or less, what kind of value or outcomes do you want to see, or are you seeing?
I would like to see once all the, we've got proper policy and procedure, and we're transparent, and what I really would like to see is my people managing wealth and prosperity instead of, what they're managing now. It's just, there's nothing solid for them to say, this is why we're going to support economic development. This is why we're going to support our resources, because we're doing so good, and this is what puts food on our table. We have a whole generation and generations to come where we want to see them managing the wealth in the communities and, prospering in our resources.
Thanks, Judy. Des, what outcomes do you want to see, or do you see from Indigenous procurement?
I think, in regards to the metrics, you just need to rework the equation. I think that Indigenous communities and businesses' success is going to be everyone's success, especially when we're talking about major projects and how we move all these projects together. Just want an equal opportunity, and, not more than equal, just an equal opportunity, just like everybody else. And, and the more projects that we are successful on, you're moving the economy forward together. And I think that that's super important. So
thanks so much, Des. And then Mick, over to you. You already mentioned, people texting you saying that they got a house or got a boat, and that must feel good. And that, that must be why you do this work.
Yeah, it's rewarding. I think one of the big things is having true Indigenous partners and maintaining continuity. And if the client could come up with a mechanism for the follow through, because sometimes the clients will come up with something that they want to see, more inclusion or whatever, more work, more lucrative work for the Indigenous people, because there's a lot of people out there that are skilled, and it's not hanging off the end of a shovel anymore. And through my experience, we sprinkled them throughout all the unions. We didn't just pile them all into the laborers union, because even the laborers union is specialized now too. It's not just that you're packing things around or digging. They specialize things there for pipeline that you got to learn to do, and you got to take the training for it. But that's why I was saying that the training comes from the union. Once you're in the union, they take care of all your training, and they pay you to do that. So that's a real key thing. But the big thing for me is the follow through from what the client wishes. I heard it before, a lot of meetings in Calgary, they call it pipeline drunk talking. You can't just promise, it's easy to stand up there and promise everybody the world. Then I guess the example would be Coastal GasLink. I went to all the meetings there, and right from Fort St. John to Smithers, and they promised you the world. And then when it came down to it, they had so many foreign companies that were involved, their joint venture with that. They didn't understand the dynamics of the Indigenous people, territories, or culture, or anything. And so they just picked out whoever they thought was Indigenous without verifying it. And, I hear it echoed in Fort St. John all the way to Haisla that there wasn't very much Indigenous inclusion. The opportunities were very minimal. And, I know that for a fact because Prairie Creek Indigenous Group, our company, was involved in that. And, we never had very many opportunities from that even to date. So follow through, the key for me. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Well, our time has ended. I appreciate all of your thoughts and perspectives and sharing your experience. I think one of the reasons why I like to hang out with you guys and help with this work with the Indigenous Resource Network is because economic development is, you can grow the pie bigger. We're not talking about, winners and losers and costs over benefits. I don't think, the companies that have done Indigenous procurement well, they don't regret it. It hasn't been a problem for their company. It's been an opportunity for their company. And I think the work that you guys do and the work some of the bigger leaders do is going to help us, move this country forward to see Indigenous inclusion as a must-have, not a nice-to-have. And we all look forward to that day where it kind of expands across the whole country in every sector. So thank you to our audience for your attention and your questions, and thank especially to our panelists and also to the U of C School of Public Policy for hosting this discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.